Hola Miguel. Uy,
Hola, buenas tardes.
ay, ¿me oyes?
Sí, te oigo.
Vale, porque tengo un poco mal, pero creo que es mi cosa mía.
Ah, sí.
Sí, pero porque llevo otros cascos, estoy desde casa, me dejo los cascos del trabajo, tengo que sincronizar otro ordenador, entonces bueno, este tipo de cosas, sin más. Estoy dándome cuenta que se pueden poner los subtítulos, por si acaso algún día alguien
Sí,
lo
pues
necesita. O Joaquín quiere participar un día, asomarse o...
sí, puede estar bien, claro.
Mm. Eh, pues nada, no sé si has visto, he entrado en el Miro antes y
Sí, yo estaba leyéndolo ahora precisamente.
vale, había puesto cosas Danica y yo he puesto lo que me había mandado Maite. ¿Danica o Erika? Ya no me acuerdo.
Danica,
Vale, pues si te parece, eh, como siempre, silencio hasta que se conecte la gente y te voy avisando.
¿de acuerdo?
Quito cámara también, ¿vale?
¿Perdón?
Quito cámara también.
Ah, vale, vale, sí. Dime, dime.
Miguel, no sé si me oyes. Si te parece, voy dando paso a la gente, que tenemos ya 2 personas conectadas. Ay, ahora no te oigo yo a ti.
A ver,
Ahora,
ahora sí, es
ahora.
que tengo aquí un botoncito que si hago cualquier cosa y lo toco sin querer, ¡pumba! Me deja mudo.
Venga, voy admitiendo, ¿eh?
Vale, de acuerdo.
Hi.
Good morning or good evening.
Anything.
Morning for Danica, I think.
Yes, yes. Good in any case. Well, I think we only. Who am I missing? Serafin
And Christy.
and Christy. Yeah. Okay. So we'll wait still for a couple minutes. Maybe Christy. There she is.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Christy.
Hi, Christy.
Hi.
So only Serafin left.
Is here. Hola, Serafín.
Hola.
Hello,
Hi.
Serafin. You look great. Well, yes, maybe we'll have some guests, but at least the ones who should be here this morning, evening, are now on the meeting, so we can start. So, well, we have gone through the 2 previous thematic group meetings. One dedicated to the first action 1 for rural proofing, for setting up good rural proofing. The first action was to establish a strong and clear political commitment. Then we went through the second thematic group on constructing a vision, let's say the ending point, the outcome, the result we want to achieve by applying by rural proofing. And now we are in the grounds of how to organize it. What would be the best architecture, political and administrative architecture, in order to guarantee that rural proofing works and works successfully. So I don't know if you could take a look at the Miro Canva, and I know that Danica has made some contributions also from the government of Castilla-La Mancha. And now or later on, you can add your own comments in the shape of stickers, virtual stickers, to this Canva on this theme. So you will find there the main questions that I suggested. So as a suggestion, you can improve it. You can add any other pertinent questions you may deem that are missing in my proposal. You can even say, Miguel, you're nuts. That doesn't make sense. So this question is irrelevant or non-pertinent, anyway, you can say it frankly. We are, all of us, learning from one another, and this is a little bit an evolving process. So if you allow me to go on, I will draw your attention to the first question I was suggesting. It's always about which government body should be, or department should be responsible for coordinating rural proofing. What would be the best way to ensure it? So usually the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Rural Affairs in Spain, and this is a little footnote I put, there's no such a thing. I mean, it's the Department of Agriculture, and whatever relates to rural affairs beyond the primary sector is embedded in this department, which I personally think is a great mistake. And unfortunately, it looks like in the European Union, it's also the same. Or we could say that probably because in the European Union level, it's that the case, many ministries in the member states tend to reproduce the pattern of embedding rural affairs within the Department of Agriculture. Well, and of course, another alternative, an office or a body reporting to the Prime Minister. What would be the best way? And according to the experience in your own countries, what would it deliver? What are the pros and cons for each alternative or solution? Anyone would like to start, to take the floor, to give an opinion?
I can speak to what I wrote on the sticky note. Can you hear me better this time? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so in Canada, yes, the tendency has also been to pair it with agriculture, or provincially in British Columbia, pair it with forestry, which I agree, Miguel, like it's a mistake, because then rural issues just get completely siloed into that one particular sector. What we have right now where I work is it's with the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation, which at least then with jobs and economy can touch on more economic sectors. However, we still get kind of siloed into, well, we're the economy, we don't do health, we don't do education. And so it's still like too narrow. And so what we have, like I mentioned in the last meeting, we have like a gender-based analysis, intersectional policy framework as well. And that's housed in the Ministry of Finance, which I think is the next best option, other than having like your own rural ministry. Because at least the Ministry of Finance, it is going to be everything, and it's going to be budget, and it's going to, it can be more overarching. So there were rumors and little talks about, where we would go, because we always have ministry shifts and different, changes with where the units are, and yeah, like we also have a Minister of State for rural communities, and they're in the Premier's office. But they don't have like a public service like department. I mean, we exist, but we're in the Ministry of Jobs, so it's kind of complicated. But yeah, my suggestion would be, if you can't have a rural ministry on its own, then the Ministry of Finance is at least more broad and overarching than siloing it into one sector.
Because you had, let's say, in the past, you had it housed in the Ministry of Agriculture in Canada?
Federally, yes. In BC, we used to have it in the Ministry of Forestry.
Oh, forestry.
BC forestry is more rural than, like, we don't have as much agriculture as in the rest of the country. So
okay, and you can tell that it's been, let's say, working better now even though it's still narrow as a scope
Yeah,
than it
I
was
think
before.
yeah, and I think it's like being in a ministry like forestry or in a ministry like agriculture, their focus is so specific that sometimes you get lost in the in the mix. But being in the Ministry of Jobs, like it is more broad, and so we get a little bit more attention, and our work is a little bit more kind of varied, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Danica, I haven't say hello to Brioni. I think it's the first meeting you are attending now. So, well, Brioni is an expert as well on rural proofing in England, or at least you have a good knowledge on how things have developed in the last 2 decades now. So probably you could give us some insight on this.
I am actually seconded to the Welsh government, so my expertise is a little bit more in Wales, but we do have two different models between England and Wales. So obviously in England there is rural affairs. We have DEFRA, which is the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Again, another one where rural affairs is generally rolled up into these ideas that rural probably means farming. The Welsh model is slightly different, so DEFRA doesn't have jurisdiction in Wales. That works in a slightly different way because Wales has ministers, but ministers do not have ministries. So the government itself is divided into different groups and there will be different ministers reporting. So within Wales, rural falls into a group called, I will have to remember the very long title, Algae, because I'm in it, LGHCCRA, which stands for local government, one thing, housing, another thing, climate change, another thing, and rural affairs. It's very broad, and this does not work together with any sort of remit. So I work in this group. I've only ever spoken to people who work on local government. I've never spoken to people who work on climate change. We don't have ways of working together very closely. So it's a little bit like maybe rural is a little bit more at home with local government and housing and looking at some of these more social issues as well. But how it fits together is a little bit less clear. Probably a broader question here, and it's not when you ask which government body should be responsible, there are also questions here, I think, around the priority of government bodies. So in England, for example, DEFRA is a very large body and it has a lot of responsibilities. It's also not a very high status one in terms of all of the different departments and ministries that there are. So obviously where something falls can depend on how well that department or ministry is thought of as well. So I think there is a broader question in there about not only where do responsibilities for rural proofing best sit with, but also a perhaps more strategic question around where is a place for them to sit where you're going to see productive action or things happen.
Thank you, Brianna. Very interesting point that you made. Is not only what place you occupy in the organizational charter. It is also what is lying behind it and how it is perceived within the overall political strategy of a given government or series of governments. Does anyone want to add anything on this?
I could add a Scottish perspective on the top of that. We are based in the Agriculture and Rural Economy Directorate, so we are lumped in with agriculture from that perspective, and our minister is Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, so we're kind of very much in that zone. But being aware that sort of silos us into agriculture and away from housing and population and transport and health. We've set up a ministerial working group that has our minister and our deputy first minister co-chairing it, and it brings in all of the cabinet secretaries who are responsible for kind of 9 different thematic areas that we cover off in the rural delivery plan. So that is again, housing, transport, health, and we have regular meetings with them where sort of the work that we're doing around rural proofing is presented to them so that they can feed in from their policy areas and provide a bit of kind of ministerial support across the piece, which is our kind of attempt at breaking out of it. But I'd say with mixed success, because in principle, it's a great idea. In practice, the pitfall is that the ministers turn up and think it's an easy meeting, because we turn up and say, this is what's happening with our rural proofing and rural policy in your policy areas. And they go, okay. And then unless you actually kind of push them, it can be quite hard to get any action from that. So yeah, that's our approach.
So there is also the need of a champion or someone within each different department to say, hey,
yeah, and I think at multi-levels, so our co-chairs are meant to kind of provide that to other ministers. We also report into a programme board that has director level engagement across Scottish Government, and then we try and build networks with kind of my opposite number in various policy areas. But it feels like at kind of all different levels, you constantly have to be very kind of outward facing and network building. There's no kind of, you can't just go through one avenue.
Now, Seraphine or Christy, whoever, what?
Maybe I leave Christy first, and perhaps I speak last.
Okay. Well, I know that rural proofing is in Estonia, and it's Ministry of Regional Affairs and Agriculture, similarly. But as I'm not working on the state level, I actually don't know how it's coordinated, or it's like, so it's quite hard for me to add something here. But yeah, that's it.
But Christy, in Estonia is not very implicated the Ministry of Justice, because I think that they have a very kind of important role.
I don't know exactly, because I know that Ministry of Regional Affairs is like the Minister of Rural Proofing is sitting, but how they are like coordinating it among different ministries, I can't tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Seraphine.
I just want to speak last, because it's better that people who actually work at the moment in administrations to speak first. As some of you know, I was a public servant for many years in various local government, regional government organizations, lately in Cosla in Scotland, and work a lot with WLGA and with the colleagues in Wales and so on. But also been working in Spain more recently on rural proofing, where I'm from. So that's why I thought it would be useful to start first with people actually being involved in this, because I would like to say something a bit more, take a step back perhaps, which is the point is that we tend to take rural proofing as a given, because it's incredible the power of words. This was mentioned in passing in Cork in a declaration of many others that they are every year, and sometimes most of the time these things, and I know very well, doesn't go anywhere. And this one was just a mention somewhere, and then for that passive mention, we had like a whole wildfire started settling Europe, and of course taking stock from things that are already happening elsewhere, and that's why perhaps to ground in Europe, the core declaration was the nexus between what's happening in other parts or individual countries, and then having a pan-European discussion on this. But I've been working on better regulation and subsidiarity assessments and things like that at European policy making for all these years. Uh, and I'm still not convinced that rule proofing is in itself something different than what it is essentially a territorial impact assessment in rural areas. The people who work in rural affairs tend to take as a given. No, I mean, rural proofing is part of a wider set of analysis the impact of public policies. It cannot be taken as a separate thing. And I fear that sometimes this is the approach taken because of the constituency working rural affairs tend to be a very cohesive one compared to other policy communities that there are. And I think we should regard first uh, proofing as a subset of a wider variety of tools that exist. Some of the tools, in terms of impact assessment of policies, are not territorialized and sometimes are territorialized. And economic science has plenty of methodologies. For instance, since we have here the UK, for instance, the UK has been always very good, particularly during the EU membership, to provide explanatory memorandums with a lot of evaluations about impact of spatial impact and sectoral impact of policies, EU policies, for instance. So much that because these explanatory memorandums were public, and I contributed to some of them sometimes, and no doubt also the civil servants from the both administrations, that they were used, and because they were in English, they were used by other countries to actually have some baseline to evaluate the impact of EU policies. So, impact of policy analysis and impact and spatial impact is something that existed for a long time. The added value of rural proofing is that is focus specifically on rural areas, but in many ways the techniques are not that different to assessing spatial inequalities in urban areas. So that's, I think, it's important to see there's a lot of transferability of techniques that exist in urban or spatial planning in general to urban areas, but the difference is that in rural proofing there is a more social element, more social anthropology element that perhaps is less prevalent and certainly in the qualitative techniques of territorial impact assessment. And you see that, for instance, at the European level, that the rural proofing is not in reality a different set of things. It's just part of the guidelines of better regulation. It was just added the rural proofing because it felt politically was a good way of getting the rural community of actors engaged. So coming back to your question, after this big meandering, I would say that what you need to have first is a system of evaluation of public policies. That, coming here again with the UK, tends to be a system of audit and evaluation that is more or less functioning, sometimes complemented by external and very respected evaluation. I don't know, the Institute of Fiscal Studies in the UK, for instance, or these additional independent bodies like the Independent Budget Authority or the Spanish equivalent. Forget now the name. But there's a number of macroeconomic evaluating agencies that were set up by agreement with the EU to the Office of Fiscal Responsibility. I think that's budget responsibility. I think it's called in the UK, and in Spain is the IREF. Is the same. They were created for the same purpose, and they actually provide a lot of evaluations as well. So what you need first is a system. In some cases, many countries don't have that. For instance, in Spain, there is a law which is not even enforced on evaluation public policy because that was a precondition for the EU to give some money of the EU Recovery Fund. That doesn't mean that there are no institutions and there are no procedures, but there's no systematic. So first is to have an integrated system of evaluation of public policies at national and ideally they should come from the very center, be that the presidency ministry, the secretary general of the permanent secretary of cabinet office, depending on the country. That is the first layer. That then, on top of that, there should be a specific focus on rural areas. And then you come when you get rural proofing, which is much more targeted and that has more anthropological things. So what is to say, rural proofing cannot be set in itself or just put in a sectoral ministry from scratch. That might be the outcome, but provided it's part of a wider set of evaluation of public policies. Because otherwise it becomes, as a way, I'm being a bit brutal here, input legitimacy. It is not surprising that if you look on a comparative basis, the countries that have something or like a rural proofing tend to have also MPs elected in a very local rural constituencies. So there's a demand. Countries that don't have very large constituencies tend to have less such a system. Why? Because there's less demand. So therefore, there's less pressure to have this sort of instruments dedicated to the areas. That's why, for instance, we have here a number of countries that do have that approach. In other countries, there's less need of that because there's less political pressure articulated in political terms because these constituencies don't reflect rural geography, so to speak. So I think I would say rural proofing should be the last layer of something wider. Of course, that doesn't help if the priority of a country, or like this case, Region Castilla-La Mancha, is about rural proofing. But Castilla-La Mancha is a good example. Why? Because they look at rural proofing after they created something. And now they're looking into rural proofing to deepen that. So that is the right approach. But building rural proofing on its own without actually having an infrastructure, I think it might lead very soon to disappointment or just change the ministry or the political priorities and the thing goes by this way, as we just heard in a previous meeting we had in this G30. But having said that, I don't think it has to be created ex novo. If you look, for instance, in the Spanish case, there is plenty of entities that do a lot of rural proofing work already, or at least part of what should be rural proofing. Only few months ago, there were like 4 audit committees, a court of auditors, depending on what you call in your country, from 3 Spanish regions who actually conducted a very thorough assessment of the population in rural areas and the failure of policies to address the support of rural areas. So there is sometimes it's not necessarily building a whole structure, but actually building a system, building on resources that already exist in the same way that there are universities that already have work on this, but it is actually not made into the political system or the policy evaluation system. It's just something stays there as academic thing. Anyway, along with the question, but I thought that was important to take a step back as well, thinking what should accompany rural proofing for rural proofing to be thriving and meaningful. Sorry for the long, lengthy detour. Thank you.
Thank you, Serafin. Very interesting. In fact, I am really writing down how important is or should be having an integrated system of the many tools already available, and mostly to have a sort of legal framework as well to give coverage to all this to work. But this is something that is not always obvious. So we will have to elaborate further on it, I guess. Well, is anything that you would like to add to this question? If not, we could proceed with if it's not redundant. So my second question was, what tasks should a rural proofing unit or department or system carry out in any department? If I look at the mirror, Canva, I find now already, oops, I'm moving something, sorry. Some answers on it. Providing advisory and support services, acting as a subject matter experts, creating training materials and data dashboards. Now that's a shopping list, very interesting. And the government of Castilla-La Mancha wrote, after the creation of the basic regulations, something Serafin mentioned, as well as the planning training work must be done for the different government bodies, with special emphasis on the offices that have to implement the regulations in each department. Rural development must be something that is internalized by each of them, and that is why we are looking for an ex-ante model, so that in the development of any plan or program, it can be seen how it will affect rural areas. What do you think? Is something missing here? Anything that you would like to stress, to add, or to contradict?
A lot of what you've just said chimes a lot with what's either happening in Scotland or what we plan to have happen. But the one thing that I didn't hear is the difference in Scotland between my team and my colleague Erica's team in Islands. She had mentioned in a previous meeting, there's legislation in Scotland to protect essentially rural proofing for islands, but there isn't for mainland Scotland. So whether that should be part of the work of kind of rural proofing teams is to examine whether legislation is needed, might be worthwhile, or to work out whether there's equity in terms of what legislation there is. It's one of the one of the controversial topics that my team fields occasionally is communities on islands have legislation that protects their interests, whereas the mainland communities don't, and that can cause some degree of unhappiness if you're on a mainland community that suffers many of the same problems.
So could we say that legislation provides for clarity, purpose, and also some references in terms of how to act? That is a requirement, as also pointed out Serafin beforehand. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well,
I put this in a different question as well, but like in British Columbia, we have kind of 3 different teams. We have the rural policy team, which is kind of in charge of the idea of rural proofing. And then we have like our program team, which administers like a rural economic development grant program. And then we have our regional economic operations team, which are based all across the territory, the province. And they are like on the ground support and engaged with, rural communities. And they kind of act as a way to, help rural communities navigate government systems and also get information from rural communities, like almost like ongoing consultation, except it's way more informal. And so then they tell the people in the policy team, hey, this is going on in a lot of communities and needs to be addressed, whether it's in the ministry that we're in or in a different ministry. So, perhaps they see an issue with, a regulation in a different ministry, and they bring it to us, and then us, like in the policy team who do the rural proofing, then approach the other ministry. So I think we're very lucky and fortunate that we have that team of on-the-ground staff that support rural communities and gather information in that way. Because it's a part of the rural proofing process, even though they're not the rural policy proofing team. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Danica. Very, very interesting indeed.
Okay, I also would like to add a little thing here, because I'm just viewing it from the county level or regional level. So maybe we need someone who is like advocating for rural issues in broader political discussions, so that, as it was also said already, we need just the rural issues to be seen whenever there are impact assessments are carried out. So I think so. Thanks.
Thank you, Christy. Now, Serafin, you were about to say something?
Yeah. just two things, just coming on the back of just been said. Well, I think the best test for whether rule proofing system works is that whether there are proposals that are rejected. That's the first level. We have seen the case of Castilla-La Mancha that is interestingly enough, there's a number of proposals that have been rejected. So I think the system sometimes works. But the best test even would be that, and that will be the hard thing, a proposal um, changes and not necessarily um, popular. I mean, the conclusion that is led is not, I mean, the rule proofing assessment comes in and the conclusions are not positive for whatever established perception there is in a rural area. I mean, sometimes it's just rule proofing also, what I'm trying to say is rule proofing is also tested in a positive way when the outcome of that process is not necessarily to follow whatever established perception that there is, that a policy echo should be. I don't know. Let's put it that way. In Soria, we have seen someone in Soria. Imagine there is a rural proofing impact assessment about the likelihood of having a new railway line, recovering a new railway line in Soria, Soria Castejo. Very polemic thing that some people in the audience know what I'm talking about. But imagine that there is an assessment. You actually ask the people, and in the end you realize, well, actually, considering the amount of money that there is for the potential outcome, maybe after foreign rule proofing, we don't need to build this because we can put buses or something instead of going through the expense of building a railway line. So sometimes the test of rule proofing is going sometimes going against the grain of what it is the established perception in a rural area, but actually having a thorough process where you actually value that. And on that, I always put the example, uh, even sometimes to I think with the Spanish Prime Minister. I remember talking about your rural division in Scotland because he was known to go to meetings with boots. And why he goes to meeting with boots? Because he actually spent half of his time, he's no longer working in Scottish government, so I can talk about that. He used to spend half of his time going to the communities. So that's why he wear boots on, because he actually was going to talk to the communities. And this is an approach. Certainly, if you compare with the Spanish approach, which is a very civil servants living in their regional capitals or provincial capitals and just doing paperwork, that's how it shouldn't be rule proofing. Rule proofing has to have an element of boots on the ground, as mentioned in the case of British Columbia as well. And that's something that, if anything, is the added value of rule proofing. When you actually have this rural topology element and actually people actually engaging with people on the ground, even if that can be cost intensive in sometimes. Sorry, thank you.
So I could draw at least two good conclusions from what you said. One is that indicator of good rural proofing might be finding mud stains on the office's floor because someone went to the mat to talk with the people. But also that rural proofing can be challenging in its outcome to, let's say, conventional perceptions of even a good deal of the stakeholders or the establishment. Is that correct? Might be that the case from what you said?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes, in rural proofing, it's, I think it's successful when it actually doesn't arrive to whatever common wisdom we might have. But actually, a thorough process where actually see the pros and cons, and you hear the people, and also let the people talk, because sometimes we tend to assume the people think in a certain way. For instance, I will say, from an idealistic perspective, I suppose people would like to have a lot of rural buses. I do. But if I ask, and I'm now in my village, and that's why there's the creaking Wi-Fi, so apologies if you don't understand me sometimes. I ask my neighbors here, and they don't want that. And but this is important to find things that goes against the perception, particularly because sometimes if you have an urban-driven perception of things, we tend to put in the mouths of people needs that they really don't want to have. And that's something that you need to understand, because there's no point in putting a policy that you think is well-meaning, but then people doesn't actually are not going to engage with that. And that has to be identified to actually then try to find a policy that actually people will engage with. And rural proofing can be helpful for that.
Definitions of rural proofing talk about a process. It doesn't anticipate what the outcome should be. So what we should focus on is on the process, that it is carried on and carried out properly. But maybe the conclusion it will deliver might not be clear or determining or well, satisfactory for many, and this is something we should accept from scratch. So yeah, it's very interesting. I don't know if you have found yourselves rural proofers present here. This situation, Briony, you want to say something on this?
Yes, I think this discussion and others' reflections is making me also think of our previous question, the yellow question on the board, and then the next question, the blue one, because so much of this question about what tasks should a unit do also affects what is the unit. Is it that we want them to have boots on the ground, which might mean they're a particular sort of unit? Or is it, for example, that we want them to be able to veto things? Or is it that we want them to, say, own a set of guidelines that perhaps they monitor? Or is it that we want them to be an advisory service? And we might want to try and do all of the above. And then we get to the next question where we start to get probably bigger. Or we might want them to do one or two of those things, which might mean a few different things for where they sit and what they look like. Although it's not rural proofing, I'm thinking as we are all speaking of, in Wales, we have a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that places statutory requirements on all public bodies, so including the equivalent of municipalities. And that is run by a separate commissioner who has an office and sits external to the government, but reports to the government. And there have been cases in the past, and when I think of Seraphine saying rural proofing works if someone has said no, there has been a case in the past where the commissioner at the time came through and argued against the extension of a road because they said that that was not commensurate with the act. Something like that might look a bit different to some of the discussions we are having, whereas more of an information service, again, a different piece of work. And then I also think of, in terms of owning things, for example, DEFRA in England own a number of sets of public guidelines. They variously monitor them, and sometimes they don't. So it's, do they just own it? Do they get something done? A whole lot of questions in here.
Thank you, Briony. Very interesting. Any other comments, or we may proceed to, well, the next question that was being anticipated, because is it possible to establish a unit responsible for rural proofing in each department at national level, whatever, without providing additional resources? It may, seem a very full question, but you know, in our times, we are finding very critical views on spending on what seems to be a burden for public administrations before delivering a piece of legislation. But in any case, some think that there's a solution by reshuffling departments and adapting them to other ways of working without claiming for a higher expenditure requirements. what do you think from what you know or from what you experience?
I can go first again. I think, like I've talked about this GBA plus gender-based thing, and I think that it's like in BC, if we could do anything where there's like a specific rural proofing person on every department or every, team, like we would have been able to do it with the gender-based analysis work that we're doing, because it's more established. But that doesn't exist. And so like there is like a small team that's responsible for that in the Ministry of Finance. And then there's a community of practice. And so for the gender-based analysis work. And so basically people like public servants in all areas of government can participate in that community of practice and become like champions or greater experts in that work on their own teams. And so they can attend like the additional trainings or additional discussions, hear what's working well, what's not working well. And so what you'll have is people all across government who have their own work within their own ministry or their own unit, but they become like the champions and the participants in that community of practice. And so we don't have that for rural at this time. But I think it's possible. And so like instead of like having a dedicated paid like rural proofing person on every single team, which would cost a fortune, like you can still have a champion within each team. But I think you still need that like core team, whether they're in the Ministry of Rural Affairs or the Ministry of Finance or Agriculture, wherever they are, who at least helps coordinate those efforts and develops the materials, organizes a community of practice or, identifies like people who can be champions within different areas of government, and kind of like lead the efforts. Otherwise, yeah, I don't like you have to have a leadership group that I think is moving the work forward. That would be my thought. But I like the community of practice model where you're getting, champions in different areas of government who are committed to advancing rural proofing or gender-based analysis or whatever it is. So.
Okay, thank you, Danica. Community of practice is a new concept to me. It blows up my head. Sorry, but it sounds incredible. I can more or less guess what it is about, and wonder how it is created. Because a practice is a sort of shared, values, targets, practices, and interactions.
So in the case of like the gender-based one, it's the team that is in charge of the GBA plus analysis that are in the Ministry of Finance. They like facilitate the community of practice. And so they plan and organize the schedule of meetings and sessions. And so typically there's one session a month and they'll have different speakers or they'll talk about different aspects of it. And then everybody who's signed up to be a part of the community of practice gets the email saying, okay, this month, the topic is this, or we'll be discussing, X, Y, or Z, or we have a special guest. And so, you've got a whole bunch of people across government who have signed on and are receiving that email and kind of committed to coming. And depending on, which unit you're a part of, like certain units want to make sure that someone on their team is in that community of practice and then bringing back that information. Other teams, not so much. It's not mandatory, but it kind of depends on like the appetite of leadership to support that work.
Thank you, Danica.
Perhaps,
Any comments?
Miguel,
Yeah.
Miguel, to contextualize this, I was born and educated in Spain, but I spent most of my life until recently in the UK public service. So So I can think perhaps could bridge the thing. I think for everybody understanding, and perhaps you also, Miguel questions or reaction can be better understood. Spain, like other countries, and like those represented here, is based on a very legalistic approach to civil service. When you have live civil servants who essentially, in the case of Spain, spend their early youth locked down 3-4 years memorizing law, essentially a type of local administrative law which you don't have in your countries, and they think everything through those terms. So that's why when you think about community of practice and so on, it's something that is rather alien because that's not how it works. It's basically people having a very defined role, setting new law and jurisprudence, and getting them out of that is very complicated. And that's why it's easy to do things. And I was more blown away when I went to the UK to see they're much more flexible over there. And that's why you can set up communities of practice. Having said that, even in Spain these days, because younger generation perhaps travel more and so on, you start having community of practice. I mean, you see that in gender community of practice are now growing in public administrations. And just to give a practical example to the colleagues of Castilla-La Mancha, it will be doing the same for rural affairs, particularly in regions like Castilla-La Mancha, which is immensely rural. So this should be relatively easy. So I think, the problem with countries like in Spain, France, Italy, and have the same type of law, we all were invaded by Napoleon, so we have to live with that, is that unless everything is in law, it doesn't work. I know. I mean, I think the point of Danica or Kate is, okay, you need a framework, but what you need also is practice, and you need incentives for civil servants to do it. Otherwise, it doesn't happen in our part of the world. But even having said that, I think to try to convince, for instance, the Government of Castilla-La Mancha to do a community of practice on, on rural proofing, for instance, across departments, I think the precedence that is about gender is a good example because that's already happening. That's something can be actually okay. Well, that sort of thing that we could perhaps also do in rural proofing as well, in addition to the formal procedural aspects that we discussed earlier.
I think we will stick very much to the practice about gender equality to inspire the rural proofing solutions we would like to promote. Wow. I remember Dr. Heather Hall from University of Waterloo stressing how important it is to fund and to give resources to rural proofing. So, but from what Danica said, perhaps we could conclude that maybe not so much, or not. It wouldn't be so as expensive as anyone could expect. I don't know what's your experience, or what are your feelings, particularly Kate and Brioni, from what you know. Maybe Christy may have also an idea of what's going on in Estonia. But is that the case? Is it expensive? Would you say this is expensive? This is a border zone?
I don't think it's expensive, following the model that Danica's talking about, and is very much what we've been doing. But I think the downside in that is, I don't know how other people's kind of staffing and resource capacity goes, but we have a lot of staff movement within Scottish Government. So people tend to kind of move roles, even if they're staying within the organisation, quite frequently. And so one of the problems that we've had with that, I wouldn't say what we're doing is as formalized as communities of practice, but we've kind of built informal networks across different policy areas to enable rural proofing. And the thing that we constantly come up against is we build those networks, we build kind of relationships with people who move roles, and then it's like we're kind of back to square one again. We haven't cracked that. When you build that community, people see it as a role to pass on within their team, that they say this is something that needs to stay within the team and somebody else needs to pick up. And I don't know whether, if we provided kind of some kind of incentive that required additional cost, that would improve, quite possibly. But at the moment, it does feel a bit like it's not very expensive, but it also doesn't always work quite the way we would like.
All right.
Yeah, I also would agree with Danica. I think this model would work with quite low costs, but also with I also agree with Kate, because when people are moving, we are just losing some contact persons, and the networks are just stop working, because sometimes there are one enthusiast person who is like taking it as a matter of like heart, and when she or he is leaving, that's it. And yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. So
okay.
And we also, I think there should be some additional funding for training people on these matters, because when it's not like a very common practice, you need to train people, you need to like set these networks and so on.
Okay. Thank you, Christy. Well, anything else on this point? If not, we can proceed with the next silly question. What would be the best way to organize the interaction of the responsible body and the corresponding rural proofing units in each department with interest groups, parliament, and political parties? I've been very much intrigued on the idea that if rural proofing delivers a politically undesirable outcome, it will really get politicians very much pissed off on civil servants and the outcomes. How do you deal with these situations in Scotland or in Wales, for instance?
I must admit that for us, we don't have that scenario occurring. Rural proofing, we have very, very vocal rural stakeholders and rural communities, and there's kind of a long-standing issue where our government ministers get quite challenging interviews, for example, when they go out to rural areas where people are saying, well, what are you doing for us? So any kind of advance on rural proofing or trying to build that parity seems to work really well with them. So I don't have that issue, which is quite nice, but I'm interested to hear what other people's experience is, just in case that ambushes us down the line.
Anyone would like to give a...
If I can, in Wales, what happens is what I often think of as competitive ruraling, in that being able to say that you are rural can be a lever on resources. So at a municipality level, there is some desire to be able to say that you are rural because you might get more resources. But because resources are scarce, you might also want to say that other municipalities are not rural, and we have some quite diverse areas. And I have certainly been in meetings with leaders of municipalities who have been very fighting about, oh, well, you're not even rural, you don't have the same issues. And I wish I knew how to juggle that, actually. If somebody finds the solution to this, and this is probably for me one of the worries about rural proofing, because whose vision of what is rural, and a bit like what Kate was mentioning about the resources that go to islands and the resources that go to versus resources that go to other communities, whose vision of where intervention should be, or who is gets to be heard. I don't know the answer. We would also in Wales talk about, we do have different political parties, which represent different types of rural areas as well. And that is another question that comes up for us. At the moment, at a government level, the way we are managing that is trying to make sure that we always consider those differences in our data so that we try to get a spread of scenarios so we can understand how things might play. But I think that's a pragmatic issue. It's not a solution.
Of course, well, there's something that when dealing with what's in action 2 in the second thematic group, when defining that rural vision, a clear delimitation or definition of what is rural had to set up from the very beginning, even taking into account that there's not one single rurality, but many ruralities. But that makes even more necessary that dialogue with stakeholders of different kinds, and of course policymakers, the decision makers. So yeah, probably that this is something to take into account when designing the whole system and the way we should work to rural proof. Any comments you would like to add to this question?
Yeah, I mean, just following up what's just been said, I think the best way of having a rural proofing system or to build a lasting rural proofing system is to have an ecosystem. I was smiling when there was Kate mentioning about the noisy voices. I was working for them for many years, and I actually know the people who were very well. The people was in part of the Islands campaign that led to the Islands Act and so on, and how they organized themselves, and how when the people who were rural areas were not islands in Scotland were vocal but not equally organized. So there's an element of political opportunity and political economy that is always going to happen. And you see that in the case of Scotland, why it happens in one way in part of the rural Scotland, and another part of rural Scotland doesn't happen the same way because of these differences in political opportunity, political economy. But the same as well as I mentioned is so the best way to hedge against that is to create a system that doesn't only rely on the governmental system of rural proofing. So, for instance, I think, and we said that in a previous piece of work for the whole of Spain, there should be for instance, you got the various independent evaluation bodies that sometimes have a legal frame. You got the accounts commissions, court of auditors that do pieces of work there. You got universities, research centers dealing with that. You got organized society. Then you got, in Spain, very vocal and very articulate municipal governments. So it is much more difficult to dispute an outcome of rural proofing that is not what politicians expected to see if there is actually seen there is many people involved and there are many voices incorporated into that process. So the rural proofing governmental part of the rural proofing element, including the citizen engagement that we discussed earlier, should be part of this larger ecosystem, because then it's much more difficult to do that. For instance, if there is like a rural proofing governmental process that provides an outcome, and then the Parliament own studies research unit actually provides a similar finding, it's much more difficult for the government of the data to say, oh, actually, just this is my civil servants who are not doing a good job, because there's actually other people who are actually providing similar approaches. And that's why, for instance, particularly significant rural proofing exercise or policy evaluation exercise should be done in a coordinated way with all these different entities that are also working on the same topic. For instance, I don't know, introduction of broadband. I mean, there is many instances that are already working on this topic in a given region or country that could actually collaborate on that, and doesn't only rely on the work of the governmental unit or department of community practice that will be doing the rural proofing itself.
Okay, so this will make rural proofing better performing, having such an ecosystem, and also will be reassuring for civil servants having to carry it out. Good. If you don't have anything to add on this, I will go on and ask, as we were talking of ecosystems and informal networks, how can we ensure the coordination and participation of local and regional governments? Should they somehow replicate the national system? Rural parliaments or rural councils or any consultation networks? What do you think? What's the best way? Because we need to assess some, let's say, different aspects around this question in order to, in the next phase, is try to come down, if possible, to a methodology to assess the quality of rural systems. Of course, taking into account the context of each country. This is not a one size fits for all, same suit for everybody. So what do you think? What are the best ways, at least from what you know? What works and what doesn't work so well?
Okay, you go ahead.
Okay, well, mine is very quick because I was going to say I don't have experience of what works well and what doesn't, but my one thought on this is the thing that we find over and over again is that the rural proofing is intended to enable flexibility, so that because we have so much different regionality within Scotland, we're constantly fighting against the kind of centralised, we'll do it all the same, and we're always trying to make sure that particular areas have the flexibility to implement policies and rural proofing in the way that works for them. So I think it would be really useful for us, rather than to say this is the best way, to say there's a number of different ways, and depending on the area that you've got and the people that you've got, you can kind of decide which option suits you best. So it's more about kind of having options that you tailor to different sort of areas and organizations than finding the best one. But that's it.
Thank you, Kate. Danica, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Canada is the size of many countries in Europe. And so each province has different models of then regional governments. And so it's like in British Columbia, we then have regional districts for, and there's over a dozen of them. And they basically, like, there's municipalities, and then the area between municipalities get called like electoral areas for the regional district. But regional districts are like little mini state governments providing different services in the rural areas that don't have municipalities, as well as coordinating different services between municipalities. And so I had never thought about it, but because I feel like there's so much more closer to on the ground that they already are like somewhat like looking at the more extreme rural areas, because that's how they're structured. But they could, like, hypothetically, they could have like a rural proofing staff member or team or policies to make sure that they're not privileging the urban municipalities within their regional district. But I'd never thought about it before. So I liked the question, and I don't know what would work better or not. But we just have such a diversity of different types of regional governments in Canada that it's hard to say. They all kind of operate a bit differently.
So result-oriented flexibility to adapt to the realities. That sounds great. I don't know, in a more Napoleonian context, what do you feel about this challenge?
I think Because I continue with it. Well, not a joke. I mean, this is rather crucial. I mean, I participate in meetings like this every day, and we tend to generalize discussions from colleagues from all over Europe. And unless you understand the very stark institutional political culture groups of countries, it's very difficult to then come to conclusions. I think it's a fair point. But coming to the Spanish, Italian case, German to a certain extent, you got 17 regions which have a level of autonomy de facto similar to a province in Canada. But at the same time, unlike Scotland, for instance, a lot of the competence are shared with the Spanish central state. So my view is you cannot have rule proof in Castilla-La Mancha unless you have a system that regional system, regional mechanism is not integrated with the Spanish one. We have now a law in Spain which is not yet being enforced. The agency that should be doing these evaluations has not been set up. I think there's one person still working on that after 2 years. Spain is very good at legislating, not necessarily about enforcing, let alone evaluating impacts. But you need to actually develop that both ways. You create an ecosystem, again, sorry, in this case, about the National Agency for Rule Proofing or the evaluations that create at national level and the equivalent in different regions, which they will be different, as mentioned there, that they will be having different arrangements. But because of the many policies, many competences are shared, and the basic definitions are defined in a very expansive way by the Spanish government, you cannot just do rule proofing in Castilla-La Mancha on its own in order to be successful. It has to be tackled. Some of that can be done, but to get to the root problems, you need to have a system Spain-wide. Which of course Castilla-La Mancha is a good example for others, even the Spanish government to look at. But beyond the regional government, in this Castilla-La Mancha, you got 5 provinces, which are the size of a big municipality in Scotland or a small municipality in British Columbia. These provinces have a council, and they are made out of local elected members from the individual small municipalities. I believe, and I think Castilla-La Mancha has been working on that, you need to integrate them also in the rural proofing mechanism because they actually are able to collect in an efficient way views from those more local areas. So you need to actually, it's not just the governmental system at regional level, you need to think certainly cases like Spain, the state government, the central government, the federal government you want, but also the sub-regional units, because in some cases they will have already an infrastructure that sometimes is underutilized. Not the first time that I do an impact assessment with colleagues from provinces, different Spanish provinces, and they have a lot of things worked through, but actually they never actually worked together when they realized actually they were evidence they could actually gather in a scale. So sometimes it's harnessing evidence, territorial knowledge that already exists at a regional level. So the Castilla-La Mancha model, I know it's not the case, but definitely it would be a mistake if you just create a regional structure without thinking of utilizing the territorial intelligence that you have, not just through the politicians, because we talk about the provinces, okay, the provincial council. There is a whole set of provincial level or comarcas, which is county level below the provinces, local action groups, and so on. So well, you need to harness this intelligence rather than just creating a structure on its own regional level. That's what I'm trying to say. Apply to the Spanish case. Sorry. Thank
you. Impressive reflections. Thank you, Serafin. Christy, how do you say it from the Estonian perspective?
Well, when I was thinking about these questions, maybe one thing I would like to bring out is that the local government involvement should be more like systematic, not incidental, because in Estonia there are 79 municipalities, among which there are 64 rural municipalities and 15 cities. And when these draft laws go down, there are very short times for the municipalities to reflect their point of view, and so maybe system is needed, how we can get the rural municipalities to speak up and give their impact also to this impact assessment.
Thank you, Christy. Well, we actually plunged into the last question, which really deals about taking into account the political and administrative structure. I would add the, let's say, social and political culture of each country, because well, when we think of methods, systems, structures, allocation of tasks, and so on, it's like piling bricks up, but we need something to have them stuck and make them a building. It's not the same a building than a pile of bricks or stones, and that kind of intangible assets, I think, should make part of our analysis when assessing the quality of rural proofing or any other method for policy impact evaluation. So yeah, that's something I really would like to highlight. I don't know if you want to add something else, any thoughts that may have come to your mind during this beautiful time. If not, I have no more questions. Maybe you may like to have any other questions we haven't thought about before. But if that's not the case, I only can end by thanking you very much for being there, for being here. And really, I'm eager to meet you personally in Cuenca. Well, very soon in May. Yeah, springtime.
Thank you.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
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 Thank you very much. Goodbye.